Hey everyone, this is lecture 2 for POS 273, International Relations, an online undergraduate course taught at the University of Maine, and I'm the instructor, Rob Glover. Today's lecture is on the emergence of the modern international system. So we're going to cover three things. We're going to talk about how history impacts contemporary international relations. We're also going to look at what are some particularly important historical events that have shaped international relations. It won't be a comprehensive history, but some really important moments that have set the contemporary global political system on a certain trajectory. And then we'll ask how the state of the international system today reflects these historical events. So, a couple quotes at the outset for thinking about this relationship between history and international relations. The first is from George Santayana. He says, "Those who cannot learn from history are doomed to repeat it." That's an idea that has become pretty frequently used, right? That if we don't learn from the past, then potentially the mistakes, the tragedies, the injustices of the past will be repeated indefinitely. And so that's one initial thing to kind of have in the back of your head, thinking about why we would look backwards to think about international relations today or international relations in the future. The second quote is from Karl Marx, and I like it, and I think you can appreciate the quote even if you don't subscribe to Marxism or think that the world is fundamentally organized around class struggle. The quote is, "Men make history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. The tradition of all dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living." That's from the kind of Marxist conception of history, right? That like different time periods, different historical periods don't make history fundamentally new. They don't engage in their daily activities unconstrained by what has happened in the past. And so in thinking about international relations, that's important to keep in mind, right? That the actions that we take today are in some ways always conditioned by what has happened previously. We can't radically change our foreign policy because there's a certain historical pattern that has emerged, and there's relationships that have been forged over time that shape and constrain what international relations looks like today. So a couple initial ideas for thinking about how history has a tie to and has an impact upon international relations today. The impact of history on international relations just generally, right? We can say that history can be a reminder of the progress that humanity has made. If we go back 100 or 200 or even 60 years, we see a world that looks very different. We see practices that are would be unthinkable today, were relatively commonplace. A couple examples I always give. One is the use of chemical and biological weapons, right? There had to be an international norm established that was something problematic. It's not to say that it doesn't happen today. Like the ongoing civil war in Syria, one of the allegations against the Assad regime has been that they're using chemical weapons, but it sparks outrage, and there had to be a norm that developed that this was something that should spark outrage, right? There was also a period in history in which states, governments, national governments would use the military to collect sovereign debt. So at one point, the military of Britain, the British Navy, came to Argentina to collect upon a sovereign debt and used military force in order to do so. And that's something that's much less common today, right? That it's virtually unthinkable that a country would use its military power to collect upon a sovereign debt. So in that sense, progress is always uneven, but we can look at certain instances of things that have happened in the past and say, well, at least that doesn't happen anymore. History can also be a reminder of past failures, past tragedies, past shortcomings. So it's very common. We use this terminology with 9/11. We use this terminology with the Holocaust, the horrors of World War II and the Nazis, to use the terminology of never again, right? And so one of the reasons we look to history is so that we can look at past injustice, past atrocities, and say, what can the international community do to ensure that never happens again. It doesn't mean that it won't happen again, but it means that we use history as a guidance point for what sorts of things to avoid and how to prevent things from happening in the future. We can also look to history to try to understand a legacy of cooperation and conflict, of exploitation and liberation. We can understand where the world is at today, economically, socially, politically, as a result of those past legacies. And we can even go further to say that history shapes and forms identities. Our understanding of what it means to be the United States in the world, what American foreign policy means, what American values represent, or what we as American citizens strive to be, is shaped by history. It's shaped by our past. And so in that sense, history socially constructs the present and the future. And we'll get more into this kind of social construction, the idea of what social construction means, when we talk about the theory of constructivism. But essentially we're saying that there's nothing inherent about an American identity or a British identity or a Japanese identity, that this is constructed through social interaction over time. That's an interesting idea, that history can play that significant of a role. And I think you can make a case that that is in fact true. So history has a really significant impact on international relations. So let's talk a little bit about the emergence of the modern international system. That term, international system, simply means the environment in which states and other global actors interact, the institutions and rules which guide and shape that interaction, and the outcomes which this interaction produces, right? So the international system is a catch-all for the environment, the institutions, and then the outcomes of the environment and institutions. It is the background condition for international interaction, and what the international system looks like, how it has emerged over time, can determine what the nature of that interaction is going to be. So we're going to follow with a history of some major kind of critical junctures in global history that have had a significant impact on what international relations looks like today and what it might look like in the future. It's not a comprehensive history. It's not a full timeline, right? That would take an entire course, an entire set of courses, perhaps a whole lifetime to go through that. That would be a comprehensive survey of global history. And that's not what we're doing. We're looking at a select number of individual occurrences that are particularly meaningful, particularly impactful for what the international system looks like today. You can read more about the timeline of international relations in your chapter, the chapter from Lamy and his co-authors that you read for today. But I want to focus in on a few really key ones. The first is what we call the Peace of Westphalia. The Peace of Westphalia emerged in the middle of the 17th century and really emerged out of a series of devastating wars. The stated kind of reason for the wars was religion, right? That there were different sects, different denominations of Christianity that existed in Europe at the time, and they were going to war with one another. But really these were wars about territory. They were wars about power. They were wars about economic control of the continent. And religion, of course, played a part, right? But religion was the justification used to go to war, right? And it was really just a power struggle at a period in which you had some major powers in Europe that didn't get along very well. These lasted for centuries, right? The period between the 14th and the 17th century was one of really devastating religious wars that sometimes stretched on for decades. You had the 30 Years' War, the 100 Years' War. And at a certain point, after centuries of this protracted warfare in which everyone was feeling pretty unsafe and it was feeling as if war was basically the default condition, the leaders of the different major powers got together and said, how can we work out some sort of arrangement in which we can coexist and we can end this cycle of violence and war? And basically what they agreed to is to allow the monarchs, to allow the leaders, at this point they would have been kings and princes and things, to allow them to have control over religious affairs within their country. So they could be expected to oversee their country's religious institutions without interference from an outside power. It was not acceptable under the terms of this peace agreement for France to invade Britain because they thought they were practicing the wrong religion. What it does is it creates an expectation of non-interference and establishes a basic principle that will become very, very important in international relations, what we call sovereignty, right? It creates the expectation of non-interference. It creates the expectation that a country can oversee its internal affairs as it sees fit, and that cannot be a justification for another country to invade or go after them violently. That has always been imperfect. It has always been kind of unrealized in certain respects. We constantly see violations of sovereignty. We constantly see instances in which a sovereignty is overridden. But it creates the principle, it creates the expectation in international politics that a country is going to have sovereignty. It also becomes an equalizer for states, right? In a formal sense, one country does not have more sovereignty than another. And the goal that it is seeking is a balance of power. It wants a balance of power among the European states rather than hegemony, rather than a single state having power over the continent. And this idea of sovereignty would become very important over time, to the point now where we refer to sovereignty and it actually has meaning in international negotiations at the United Nations. When a country is talking about its foreign policy, if you invoke sovereignty and say you are working to protect your sovereignty, that means something, and potentially others will respect that. The next major chapter that we need to talk about is European colonialism. Really beginning in the 15th century and going right up until the 20th century, the final colonial powers began to dismantle their last colonial holdings in the latter half of the 20th century. You had this period in which European powers sought to expand outward. And they wanted to establish formal control over foreign territories and foreign peoples. And there were a number of reasons why they could do this. First is advances in technology, right? You had advances in navigation, advances in military hardware, advances in map making and understanding the layout of the world, shipbuilding, these sorts of things that enabled European powers to go strike out and travel over further distances than they had previously. But you also had the internal stability created by the Peace of Westphalia, right? Relative to other periods in history, countries were not so much concerned about protecting against foreign invaders anymore. And because they had this, relatively speaking, this internal stability, they could go out and try to expand their power to other parts of the world. And so that had a significant impact on what the world looked like. In short, much of the world's territory became a colonial possession of one European power or another. And that is really significant, right? Why is it significant? Well, it establishes a hierarchy on the global level in international politics between the countries that had vast, expansive colonial empires and those that did not. It also serves as a source of resource and labor extraction that fuels a really unprecedented period of economic expansion and we could say the Industrial Revolution, right? That the Industrial Revolution would not have happened without the resources and the labor provided by colonial expansion. And then lastly, these European powers are going to draw borders, right? So you look at, the contemporary territorial borders of the world, and many of these territorial borders were drawn at the time of European colonialism. And that has implications that persist to this day. You have some countries that really did not emerge organically. They emerged as a result of external forces, and there wasn't careful attention devoted to what is the religious makeup of these countries, what languages do they speak, what ethnic groups exist here. And so you have some countries that are kind of, they don't make a lot of sense in terms of what is contained within their borders, but they made perfect sense to the European powers that were drawing those colonial borders. We can see a bit of this in the maps of European colonialism from the 1500s up until the contemporary period. You had various powers that had different colonial footprints, right? So you had, the French had a significant footprint in Africa. You had British colonies extending over to the United States, down into southern Africa, over into the Middle East, all the way down to Australia. You had the Dutch, you had the Germans, you had minor powers like the Italians, right? They had a colonial presence in the Horn of Africa. And so in some places you still see, like, Libya and Eritrea and Ethiopia, you still see elements of that that Italian presence in northern Africa, right? But the bottom line is that the territorial borders today bear a strong resemblance to the colonial borders that were drawn, and those colonial borders that were drawn were largely artificial. And so some of the most tense, difficult neighborhoods that exist in the world today, geographically speaking, are really a product in a lot of ways of that period of European colonialism. Jumping ahead to the next major historical event, the world wars of the 20th century. The 20th century really marks a period in which total war, right, intense global interstate violence that basically encapsulates the entire world, becomes a serious issue, right? Becomes something that changes our perceptions of what war really is, right? So we have this increased technological sophistication in the weapons deployed. We start to see, chemical and biological weapons developed. The Second World War would see the development of nuclear weapons. And we have this tremendous capacity to inflict violence that had never existed before in human history. And because of that, right, because of this change in our capacities to inflict violence upon our adversaries, there is a real push to find ways to limit and constrain war, right? To find ways in which diplomacy would helpfully negotiate us out of war. War would not be viewed as a desirable option for major powers, and really to figure out ways to utilize international law and to utilize international organizations to prevent war from happening and to mitigate some of its effects. So we see these wars basically push the international community towards an expanded realm of international law and to create settings that hadn't previously existed, like standing locations where global diplomacy can happen. There was a push for something called the League of Nations after World War I, and eventually, after World War II, we had the creation of the United Nations, which exists to this day. The recognition that we now had technology that had the capability of killing hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people with a single weapon, also created this recognition of the gravity of war, right? That if two nuclear-armed adversaries went to war with one another, potentially the world could be over. And so it really created a sense that you needed these institutions. They needed to be made strong, and they needed to be settings that the major powers would use. World War II also leads to a massive wave of decolonization for a couple of different reasons. So that big colonial empire that we just looked at starts to dismantle, had already begun to dismantle in the wake of World War I, but really rapidly begins to become dismantled after World War II. And part of that was just the fact that many of the most significant holders of colonial possessions were part of the Allied powers, right? So at the same time they were talking about the horrors of the Nazis and how terrible it is to be engaged in expansion, right? Taking over territory, annexing territory, and claiming it as your own. They were in this colonialism game in which it seemed that they were kind of doing the same thing, right? Maybe not quite with the same ideology that the Nazis had, but with a sense of, a racial hierarchy, and they were at the top. And so there was this tremendous sense of hypocrisy that existed that fueled some of the anti-colonial sentiment within those countries. The other piece was that they could simply no longer afford to have these massive colonial empires. They couldn't ensure that they would actually be able to maintain control. There was anti-colonial movements in places like India and Africa, and it just became too costly and too difficult to maintain them. So we see this massive wave of decolonization, which results in a series of new countries with fledgling institutions, and their borders didn't make a lot of sense. So you ended up with entire regions of the world that were relatively ill-equipped to be independent, but all of a sudden, nevertheless, were independent. The Cold War is another really important moment. Basically, with the Cold War, you have two major global powers. You have a bipolar system in which the United States is one pole and the Soviet Union is another pole. And really, the whole global alliance structure revolves around those two major powers. Their relationship is hostile. It's openly hostile, right? And they generally distrust one another, and that persists basically from the late 1940s right up until the late 1980s into the early 1990s. The other issue with this is that these are the two most sophisticated military powers in the world. They're both, by the late 1940s, both of them have nuclear capabilities, and they are maintaining an alliance structure through which numerous proxy wars are playing out. So it might not be the case that the United States and the Soviet Union are openly at war with one another, but there are plenty of wars and civil conflicts happening within countries in which the United States is backing one side, the Soviet Union is backing another, and it's essentially, it's a very violent game of chess that's playing out with the United States and the Soviet Union moving the pieces. It also suggests that, if you have a proxy war, it's very easy for a larger global conflict to break out. So it was a really tense and uncertain period in the world. It's significant for a number of reasons. One is that the arms race between these two powers helped to fuel a massive proliferation of weapons globally and generally made the world a more violent place. The proxy wars and interventions that happened in the countries that each side was trying to support shaped the trajectories of those countries in basically every region of the world. You go anywhere and you look at politically turbulent events that happened in the 1950s and the 1960s, and the Soviet Union was involved, the United States was involved, often through its CIA and interventions that were occurring there. And really, all foreign policy from the period from the 1940s up until the 1990s was shaped by what was happening with the Cold War. That was a constant consideration. That was the lens really through which everything was viewed. So the Cold War, you really can't underestimate its impact and its importance for understanding international relations in that period. And then lastly, 9/11 and terrorism. So when the Soviet Union fell and broke up into its constituent states in the early 1990s, there was this period in which it was very unclear what should drive the international system. That lens that you had, right, that was informing foreign policy on both sides, that was the lens through which everyone understood international relations, all of a sudden was gone, and it wasn't clear what would replace it. And so in the 1990s, you had this kind of strange period of uncertainty, but also optimism, that we were, as one scholar called it, the end of history, right? That liberal democracy had won, and the United States was the unrivaled global superpower. And so conflict and foreign policy was going to look completely different. And then September 11 happened. And September 11th kind of created a new lens for understanding the world. Combating international terrorism became the central focus of the United States and its allies. It became, for a time, really the dominant goal for the international community. And it also created a justification for a reinvigoration of the U.S. military, right? Up until this point, you had a lot of people saying, well, why do we need such a large, such a well-funded military if our main adversary, the Soviet Union, is gone and most of the other major militaries in the world belong to our allies? And so this created a justification for a more hawkish foreign policy in the United States, and also just massive increases in military and security spending. It's significant because it provided the United States the impetus for two protracted foreign wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. It also shifted the international security focus. Our threats were no longer superpowers. It wasn't simply, what state that is not friendly to us has the largest military. We also became really concerned about failed states in which law and order had broken down, states in which international terrorist operations could operate basically without any sort of checks or any sort of ability of the government to control them or crack down on them. And the destabilization of the Middle East that occurred through military action by the United States set in motion a series of ripple effects that would drive other outcomes. I think it's not too much of a stretch to say, for instance, that the Arab Spring that we saw just a few years ago was set in motion by this destabilization of the Middle East. We know, for instance, that ISIS really emerged in the power vacuum that was Iraq and Syria after the United States invasion. And in addition, the civil war in Syria, right? The ongoing tragic civil war in Syria that has resulted in so many refugees, so many people killed, and really an area in which ISIS for a while was operating pretty effectively was an outgrowth of this destabilization of the region. So really significant. If we want to look at politics in the Middle East right now, we have to think about 9/11. We have to think about our attempts to conduct this broader war on terror. So what does history teach us? We've looked at some important moments in history, some critical junctures in which if things hadn't played out the way that they did, we might have been talking about a different world that we live in. I think the first thing that we can say is the story of international relations is one of progress, but it's ambiguous progress. We're moving forward and things are happening, and at times they appear as if it's a good thing, but there's always kind of another side to that, right? So there's always another side to any story, right? And international relations is no exception. You can also look at history and say our greatest achievements have often happened as a result of our greatest failures and tragedies. So the fact that we had two wars which killed millions of people in the 20th century, yes, it helped us create a system of international organizations that it's a setting in which diplomacy can occur. It's a setting in which international law can be written. It's a setting in which norms can be advanced that hopefully make our world safer and less volatile. But it occurred out of really one of the darkest chapters in human history. We can say that we have certain expectations with regard to law and rights and justice and fairness and goodness. And if we live in a well-ordered society, and if we live in a stable society in which justice and rule of law actually functions, we come to expect those things. Once we move up to the international realm, in which we're dealing with interactions between states, it's much harder to achieve and realize those things. And the last thing that we can say is that it's impossible to fully understand the identities and interests and objectives of contemporary states without delving into their history, right? So if you want to understand why the United States behaves in a certain way right now, why the Trump administration takes a certain approach to foreign policy, or why the British government defines its national interest in a certain way, you have to go back and you have to understand the history of those countries and where they are right now, what moments in the past have shaped that contemporary perspective. You can't understand international relations without some sense of history. It's really important. The close of your chapter has a good overview of some of the dynamics of different regions. So if you want to kind of delve into different regions of the world and where they are right now, you can review that. Also, I'd encourage you to just look at the global section of a major national newspaper, right? Look at, what are the stories emerging out of the Middle East? What's happening in Southeast Asia? And try to understand not just, what's happening in the moment, but also the larger historical processes of which the unfolding events are a part of, right? It's really essential to kind of get that broader sense of history if you're going to understand what's happening at any given moment. For next time, we're going to shift gears a little bit. So these first two classes, one has been an overview of international relations, and this lecture has been talking about the emergence of the international system and how history has shaped what the international system looks like today. We're going to shift gears in the next lecture to talking about theory and why theory is important in understanding international relations. So the core thing I would say is that there's so much happening in international relations at any given moment that we need something to help us make sense of the noise. Otherwise, it just looks like chaos, right? It just looks like something that is incomprehensible and overwhelming. And so I think the core value of theory is that it can help us make sense of what's unfolding in international relations. So you have a couple readings. The first is Sterling Foker's first chapter and her appendix. The first chapter is just an overview of how to make sense of IR theory. What is IR theory? And then the appendix is an extended review of the case that will become really the center point of her book, the Iraq War. So read the appendix, get a sense of, what was happening with the Iraq War, what transpired in the Iraq War, and that will be an important basis for understanding all of the different interpretations using different theories that follow in that text. The selection from Dresner is really the introduction to his book, talking about IR theory and zombies, right? But giving you a sense of like why use something that seems a little comical and a little ridiculous as a means for understanding international relations and IR theory. So I'll wrap up there. Hopefully these first two classes have provided you kind of a basis to understand what's happening in international relations and the role of history. And next class, we'll shift gear into some of the theory and how to utilize some of the theory. So thanks very much.